Welcome, weary travellers of the night. This is Sleepless Survivors, your companion through the quiet hours when sleep eludes you. Tonight, we embark on an ancient journey that spans millennia, diving deep into one of humanity's most fascinating and mysterious origin stories. Let your mind drift as we explore the tale of the Anunnaki, those enigmatic beings who, according to ancient texts, descended from the heavens to shape our world and guide the earliest human civilizations. Close your eyes if you wish. Get comfortable. Let the weight of the day fall away from your shoulders. Tonight's journey will carry you through time itself, back to an age when gods walked among mortals, when the line between myth and history blurred into something beautiful and strange. This is a story whispered in cuneiform on clay tablets, carved into temple walls, and passed down through countless generations. The Anunnaki Chronicles begin not on Earth, but in the cosmic expanse, on a planet the ancient Sumerians called Nibiru. Picture, if you will, a world travelling through the darkness of space on an elliptical orbit so vast that it takes thousands of years to complete a single revolution around our sun. This distant world, shrouded in mystery, was home to an advanced civilization facing a crisis that would change the destiny of two planets forever. The atmosphere of Nibiru was failing. Slowly, inexorably, their protective sky was degrading, allowing harmful radiation to penetrate and threaten all life on their world. The Anunnaki, brilliant and desperate, searched for a solution. Their scientists discovered that fine particles of gold suspended in their atmosphere could reflect radiation and repair the damage. But Nibiru's gold reserves had been depleted over eons of mining and use. They needed to find more, and they needed to find it quickly. Their astronomers turned their instruments outward, scanning nearby planetary systems during their long orbital journey. And there, glinting like a jewel in the cosmic void, they found Earth. This small blue world, young and rich with resources, held vast quantities of the gold they so desperately needed. The year was approximately 450,000 years ago by our current calendar, though such numbers feel almost meaningless when discussing such deep time. The decision was made. An expedition would be launched. The first Anunnaki spacecraft descended through Earth's atmosphere, their crews marvelling at this pristine world teeming with life. The mission was led by Enki, whose name translates to Lord of the Earth, a brilliant scientist and engineer who would become one of the most important figures in the unfolding story of humanity. Enki was the son of Anu, the king of the Anunnaki civilization on Nibiru, and he carried the weight of his people's survival on his shoulders. The landing site was carefully chosen. The southeastern region of what we now call Africa, near the shores of ancient seas, provided ideal conditions. The climate was warm, water was abundant, and preliminary surveys had detected rich gold deposits beneath the surface. Enki's team established the first outpost, a base they called Eridu. This name would echo through history, for Eridu would be remembered in Sumerian texts as the very first city ever created, the place where kingship descended from heaven. Imagine that moment, that first contact between an alien intelligence and the pristine Earth. The landscape was vastly different from what we know today. Massive creatures, the dinosaurs, had long since vanished. Their reign ended 65 million years earlier. But the world was still wild beyond imagining. Enormous mammals roamed vast grasslands. The climate was warmer, sea levels were different, and the continents themselves were still slowly drifting toward their present positions. The Anunnaki set to work immediately. Mining operations began in southern Africa, in regions that modern archaeology suggests were among the first places humans developed sophisticated mining techniques. Deep shafts were dug into the earth. The work was grueling, even for the advanced Anunnaki. Gold was extracted, refined, and prepared for transport back to Nibiru when their planet's orbit next brought it close enough to Earth for the journey to be practical. But as the millennia passed, a problem emerged. The Anunnaki workers, those assigned to the mines, grew weary and resentful. They had not travelled across the cosmos to become miners, toiling in darkness and heat, extracting gold from the stubborn earth. Tensions rose. The workers began to rebel against the leadership, particularly against Enlil, Enki's half-brother, who had arrived later to oversee the operations and establish order. Enlil was different from Enki in temperament and philosophy. Where Enki was creative and empathetic, Enlil was rigid and authoritarian. He was the lord of the command, the administrator, the one who enforced the rules and maintained the hierarchy. The contrast between these two brothers would drive much of what followed, their conflicts shaping the very nature of human civilization. The rebellion reached a critical point. The mining workers laid down their tools and marched to Enlil's compound, demanding relief from their endless labour. The situation could have descended into violence, threatening the entire mission, and, by extension, the survival of Nibiru itself. A solution had to be found, and it needed to be radical. It was Enki who proposed the answer that would change everything. Earth already had primitive hominids, early evolutionary ancestors of modern humans. These creatures showed promise, intelligence beyond other animals, but lacked the full cognitive abilities of the Anunnaki. What if, Enki suggested, we could uplift them? What if we could blend their essence with our own, creating a hybrid being capable of understanding instruction and performing labour, but not so advanced as to threaten our position? This proposal was controversial. It raised profound ethical questions that divided the Anunnaki leadership. Enlil opposed the idea vehemently, seeing it as dangerous and unnatural. But Enki persisted, and eventually, with the blessing of their father Anu and the Council on Nibiru, the experiment was approved. Humanity's creation story was about to begin, not through divine proclamation, but through genetic engineering in an ancient laboratory. The process was complex and took many attempts. Enki worked with Ninhursag, whose name means Lady of the Mountain, a brilliant geneticist and medical expert. Together, they experimented with combining Anunnaki DNA with that of Earth's primitive hominids, likely Homo erectus or a similar species. The early attempts failed. The hybrid creatures were sterile, unable to reproduce. Others had defects that made them unsuitable for the intended purpose. But Enki and Ninhursag persisted, refining their technique. They used what ancient texts describe as the essence of the Anunnaki, combined with the clay of Earth. In modern terms, we might understand this as genetic material and organic matter. The process involved what the texts call birth goddesses, Anunnaki females who carried the hybrid embryos to term. Imagine their dedication, these women who volunteered to bring a new species into existence within their own bodies. Finally, success. The first viable hybrid was born, a being that combined the physical robustness and adaptability of Earth's hominids with enhanced intelligence derived from Anunnaki genetics. This being could understand complex instructions, could learn and reason, could use tools with sophistication previously unseen on Earth. The Anunnaki called these new beings Lulu, which translates to mixed worker or primitive worker. But Enki saw something more in his creation. Unlike Enlil, who viewed the Lulu as merely tools, Enki recognized in them a spark of something profound. They were conscious, aware, capable of joy and suffering. He became protective of humanity, a theme that would repeat throughout the ancient texts. In many ways, Enki became humanity's champion among the Anunnaki, often working to protect and advance human interests, even when it put him at odds with his own people. The first humans were deployed in the mines and in agricultural operations. They relieved the Anunnaki workers, allowing the gold extraction to continue smoothly. But something unexpected happened. Something Enlil had feared and Enki had perhaps secretly hoped for. The humans began to develop beyond their intended parameters. They learned quickly, adapted, showed creativity and innovation. They formed social bonds, developed early forms of culture, created primitive art and music, and they reproduced. Unlike the early failed experiments, these humans could have children, could pass on their traits to the next generation. The population began to grow, spreading beyond the immediate areas where they had been created and deployed. They moved into new regions, adapted to different environments, began to differentiate into distinct groups. The Anunnaki watched this proliferation with mixed feelings. Some, like Enki, were fascinated and proud. Others, like Enlil, grew increasingly concerned. These beings were becoming too numerous, too independent, too much like their creators. They were loud, messy, chaotic in ways that offended Enlil's sense of order. Tensions began to mount once again. Time passed, measured in thousands of years. The Anunnaki maintained their settlements on Earth, which grew from simple mining outposts into elaborate cities. They established major centers in Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in a region the Sumerians would later call the land between the rivers. Each major Anunnaki figure established their own city-state, ruling over populations of humans who served them and worshipped them as gods. Enki established his primary city at Eridu in the south. Enlil claimed Nippur, which became the religious and administrative centre of the region. Ninhursag had her own city, as did other prominent Anunnaki. These weren't just settlements, they were sophisticated urban centres with impressive architecture, advanced irrigation systems and complex social structures. The humans who lived there were taught agriculture, animal husbandry and the basics of civilization. But underneath this apparently stable system, problems simmered. The human population continued to grow exponentially. They were, after all, designed to be robust and fertile. By some estimates suggested in the ancient texts, humanity numbered in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions. They spread far beyond the controlled environments of the Anunnaki cities, establishing their own settlements, developing their own nascent cultures. More troubling to Enlil was another development. Some Anunnaki, particularly the younger generation who had been born on Earth rather than on Nibiru, began to intermingle with humans in ways that went far beyond the master-servant relationship intended. They formed emotional attachments, and in some cases, romantic and sexual relationships with particularly attractive or intelligent humans. The texts describe these unions explicitly. The sons of the gods found the daughters of men beautiful and took them as wives. These weren't just casual encounters, but committed relationships that produced offspring. These children, hybrids of hybrids, possessed even more Anunnaki genetics than the original created humans. They grew to be larger, stronger, and more intelligent than normal humans. Ancient texts from various cultures describe them as giants, mighty warriors, and heroes of old. The Nephilim, as they were called in later Hebrew texts, became a powerful force in the ancient world. They were the champions and kings, the legendary figures whose deeds were celebrated in the earlier stories, but to Enlil, they represented an unacceptable corruption of the natural order, a blurring of the line between Anunnaki and human that could lead to consequences he couldn't control. Enlil's frustration reached a breaking point. The Earth was becoming too noisy, too chaotic, too filled with beings who had never been meant to exist in such numbers. He began to advocate for a drastic solution. The humans had served their purpose. Gold mining operations were well established and could be managed with a much smaller population. It was time, Enlil argued, to reduce the human population drastically, or eliminate it entirely. The Anunnaki leadership was divided. Enki opposed his brother vehemently. These were conscious beings, he argued, who had done nothing wrong except exist as they were created to exist. They had feelings, families, hopes, and dreams. Destroying them would be an atrocity. But Enlil had support among those who shared his concerns about the chaos of overpopulation and the genetic contamination from interbreeding. The debate might have continued indefinitely, but then nature itself intervened in the form of impending catastrophe. The Anunnaki scientists, with their advanced understanding of astronomy and planetary mechanics, made a disturbing discovery. Nibiru's next approach to the inner solar system would coincide with a critical instability in Earth's ice caps. The gravitational effects, combined with other factors, would trigger a massive flood, a deluge that would reshape the planet's surface and destroy most life. This was the Great Flood, the event remembered in mythology and ancient texts from cultures across the world. The Anunnaki knew it was coming, possibly years or even decades in advance, and Enlil saw in this natural disaster an opportunity. The problem of overpopulation would solve itself. He proposed that the Anunnaki prepare to survive the cataclysm, but keep the information secret from humanity. The humans would be wiped out, and afterward the Anunnaki could start fresh with a smaller, more manageable population. Enki was horrified. This was genocide by omission, allowing billions of years of evolution and all the humans they had created to be destroyed when they had the knowledge and ability to save at least some of them. But he was bound by an oath, swearing to the council that he would not warn humanity of the coming disaster. The decision had been made, and even Enki's considerable influence couldn't overturn it. But Enki was clever, and his compassion for humanity outweighed his oath to his fellow Anunnaki. He couldn't directly warn a human, but perhaps he could find another way. He chose a man named Ziusudra in the Sumerian texts, Atrahasis in the Akkadian version, and later remembered as Noah in Hebrew tradition. This man was noted for his wisdom, righteousness, and his devotion to Enki. In a famous scene described in ancient texts, Enki spoke to the wall of Ziusudra's reed hut. ostensibly addressing the wall itself rather, than the man who lived there. He described in detail the coming flood and gave precise instructions for building a large boat, a vessel capable of surviving the deluge. The boat should be sealed with pitch, designed with specific dimensions, and provisioned for a long voyage. Most importantly, Ziusudra should bring aboard his family and representatives of all animal species, preserving the genetic diversity of Earth's life. Ziusudra followed these instructions despite the ridicule of his neighbours who couldn't imagine rain falling in quantities sufficient to flood the world. He worked for years, perhaps decades, building his ark and gathering supplies. His family helped him, trusting in his wisdom and in the divine warning he had received. Animals were collected, food was stored, and preparations were made for surviving an unimaginable catastrophe. The Anunnaki, meanwhile, made their own preparations. They couldn't leave Earth entirely as Nibiru's orbit wouldn't bring it close enough for easy transit for many more years. Instead, they planned to wait out the flood in their spacecraft, orbiting safely above the destruction until the waters receded. They could then return to the surface and begin rebuilding their operations. The day arrived. The texts describe it with vivid imagery that speaks to the terror of those who experienced it. The fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened. In more scientific terms, the massive ice sheets that covered the polar regions suddenly became unstable. Enormous chunks broke off and crashed into the oceans, creating tsunamis of unimaginable scale. Simultaneously, the gravitational stress triggered massive volcanic eruptions, and perhaps even the release of subterranean water. The resulting flood was catastrophic beyond description. Walls of water hundreds of feet high swept across continents. Entire civilizations were erased in hours. The carefully cultivated fields and cities of the ancient world disappeared beneath churning seas. Millions died, the sounds of their screams lost in the roar of water and wind. The Earth's very geography was reshaped as coastlines were redrawn and river valleys were scoured clean. The Anunnaki watched from orbit, and the texts say that even they were shocked by the scale of destruction. Ninhursag wept for her creations, for all the humans she had helped bring into existence, and who were now dying in terror and agony. Some of the Anunnaki began to question whether they had made the right decision in allowing this to happen. Even Enlil, seeing the reality of the devastation, was moved despite his earlier convictions. But Ziusudra's ark rode the waves. The vessel Enki had helped design proved seaworthy even in those impossible conditions. For days and then weeks, the ark drifted on a world covered entirely by water. Everything familiar was gone. The mountains were submerged, the landmarks erased. There was only water stretching to the horizon in every direction beneath skies still darkened by volcanic ash and water vapour. Gradually the waters began to recede. The immense energy that had driven the flood dissipated. Water flowed back into ocean basins that had been temporarily displaced. New land emerged, often radically different from what had existed before. The ark eventually came to rest on a mountaintop, on a peak that had been tall enough to emerge first from the receding waters. Ziusudra sent out birds to test whether the land was ready. First a raven, which found no place to land and returned. Later a dove, which also returned. Finally, after more time had passed, another dove that returned carrying an olive branch, a sign that vegetation was beginning to grow again on the transformed Earth. It was safe to disembark. The Anunnaki spacecraft descended as well, their crews returning to survey what remained of their carefully constructed civilization. What they found shocked them. Everything was destroyed. Their cities were buried under layers of mud and sediment. Their agricultural systems were ruined. The infrastructure they had built over millennia was simply gone. They would have to start over from almost nothing, and then they discovered that Enki had saved Ziusudra. Enlil was furious, feeling betrayed by his brother. He confronted Enki, demanding to know how the secret had been revealed. But others among the Anunnaki, seeing the desolation and realizing that without Ziusudra's survival, they would have to recreate humanity from scratch, argued that perhaps it was for the best. Humanity would serve them again, but this time with a proper understanding of their place in the cosmic order. A compromise was reached. Humanity would be allowed to survive and repopulate the Earth, but measures would be taken to ensure they never again grew so numerous or so independent as to threaten the order the Anunnaki wished to maintain. The human lifespan, which ancient texts suggest had been remarkably long before the flood, would be shortened. The ancient pre-flood patriarchs supposedly lived for hundreds of years, But post-flood humanity would have lifespans measured in decades rather than centuries. Additionally, humanity would be divided. Instead of a single unified population that could become too powerful, humans would be split into different groups, given different languages, and settled in different regions. This is the origin story, according to these ancient traditions, of the diversity of human cultures and languages. It was a deliberate strategy of division to maintain control. But Enki negotiated one crucial concession. Humanity would be given knowledge. Not all the knowledge of the Anunnaki, but enough to develop true civilization. Humans would be taught the arts of writing, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, metalworking, and architecture. They would be able to build cities of their own, though never as grand as those of the Anunnaki. They would be able to organize themselves into complex societies. This transfer of knowledge was portrayed in later myths as the teaching of the wise ones, the bringers of civilization. In Sumerian texts, Enki is often credited with teaching humanity the essential skills they needed to thrive. He became the god of wisdom, magic, water, and creation. Temples were built in his honor, and his priests maintained and expanded the knowledge he had given. The post-flood world slowly recovered. Ziusudra's descendants, blessed by the Anunnaki for their survival, became the nucleus of the new human population. They spread out across the transformed landscape, following rivers and coastlines, seeking fertile land where they could establish new settlements. The Anunnaki helped them, providing guidance and resources, but also maintaining clear hierarchies of power. New cities were founded, each associated with a particular Anunnaki patron. These cities weren't just human settlements, they were theocratic states where the Anunnaki lived as divine kings and queens. The grandest temples were built in these early post-flood cities, massive ziggurats that reached toward the heavens, symbolizing the connection between Earth and the realm of the gods. One of the most important of these cities was Uruk, which would eventually be associated with the legendary King Gilgamesh. Another was Ur, a wealthy trading centre. Nippur remained the religious centre where Enlil held court. Each city had its own character, its own traditions, but all acknowledged the overarching authority of the Anunnaki. The relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity during this period was complex. On one level, it was clearly hierarchical, with the Anunnaki as undisputed rulers and humans as subjects and servants. But it wasn't purely exploitative. The Anunnaki genuinely needed humanity's labour, and humans benefited from the knowledge and protection the Anunnaki provided. In many ways, it was a symbiotic relationship, even if the power dynamic was severely imbalanced. Humans served in the temples, maintaining them and providing offerings of food, drink, and crafted goods. The most skilled human artisans created beautiful objects for their divine rulers, demonstrating increasingly sophisticated techniques in metalworking, pottery, weaving, and jewellery making. Human farmers cultivated vast fields of grain, the surplus supporting not just the Anunnaki, but also the emerging class of human priests, administrators, and specialists. Education became institutionalized. Temple schools taught select humans, usually the children of elite families, the cuneiform writing system the Sumerians used. This wedge-shaped script pressed into clay tablets allowed for record-keeping, literature, legal codes, and the preservation of knowledge across generations. The ability to read and write became a powerful tool, creating a literate class that could serve as intermediaries between the Anunnaki and the broader human population. Medicine developed as Anunnaki knowledge was shared with human practitioners. The Sumerians created extensive pharmacopoeias, understanding the properties of hundreds of plants and minerals. Surgical techniques were developed and taught. While primitive by modern standards, these ancient doctors could set broken bones, treat wounds, perform basic surgeries, and compound medicines that, while not always effective, represented genuine medical knowledge rather than mere superstition. Mathematics flourished. The Sumerians developed a sexagesimal system, base 60 mathematics that we still use today in our measurements of time and angles. They understood geometry well enough to survey land, design buildings, and calculate areas and volumes. They tracked the movements of celestial bodies with remarkable precision, creating astronomical tables that predicted eclipses and planetary positions. Legal systems emerged, establishing order in growing populations. The earliest known written laws come from this period, codes that specified punishments for various crimes, established property rights, regulated commerce, and defined social relationships. These weren't primitive systems. They showed sophisticated understanding of justice, proportionality, and the needs of complex urban societies. But as human civilization grew more sophisticated, a tension emerged that would define much of subsequent history. Humanity was becoming less dependent on direct Anunnaki oversight. Human kings, descended from the original divine human hybrids or appointed by the Anunnaki, began to rule with increasing autonomy. They still acknowledged the Anunnaki as supreme beings, but day-to-day governance of human affairs fell to human administrators. The Anunnaki themselves were changing as well. Generations born on Earth had never seen Nibiru. Earth was their home now, not some distant planet their ancestors had left millennia ago. Some began to question their mission. Gold was still being mined and supposedly being sent to Nibiru, but contact with the home planet had become sporadic due to the vast distances and orbital mechanics involved. Were they still serving a living civilization, or had something changed on distant Nibiru? Personal dramas among the Anunnaki added to the complexity. These were not distant, dispassionate gods, but beings with emotions, ambitions, jealousies, and conflicts. Enki and Enlil continued their philosophical and practical disagreements, their rivalry extending to their descendants. Inanna, known for her beauty and fierce temperament, pursued her own agendas, sometimes allying with one faction, sometimes with another. These conflicts among the Anunnaki occasionally spilled over into human affairs. City-states aligned with different Anunnaki patrons found themselves drawn into their patrons' disputes. Wars were fought, with human armies serving as proxies for Anunnaki disagreements. The texts describe these conflicts vividly, sometimes mentioning weapons that sound remarkably like advanced technology, devastating cities with fire from the sky, and weapons that killed without leaving visible wounds. One of the most significant events of this era was the incident at Babel, remembered in biblical tradition as the Tower of Babel. According to the ancient texts, humanity, growing confident in their abilities, and perhaps encouraged by some of the Anunnaki, who saw value in human advancement, decided to build a tower that would reach to heaven itself. This wasn't just metaphorical. They literally intended to construct a structure tall enough to reach the realm where the Anunnaki dwelt. The tower grew higher and higher, an engineering marvel that pushed the limits of ancient technology. It represented humanity's growing ambition, their desire to be equal to the gods rather than merely servants. But to Enlil and those who shared his views, it represented unacceptable hubris. Humans were becoming too unified, too capable. If they could build this tower, what might they attempt next? The response was decisive. The project was destroyed, possibly through military action, possibly through sabotage that caused the massive structure to collapse. But more importantly, the strategy of linguistic division was implemented. The texts say that humanity's languages were confused, that people who had previously understood each other suddenly could not communicate. Workers on the tower found themselves unable to coordinate their efforts. The unified human civilization fragmented into different linguistic groups. Modern scholars debate the historicity of this event, but the underlying concept reflects a real historical phenomenon. The ancient Near East saw the divergence of languages as populations separated and developed their own dialects, and eventually entirely distinct languages. Whether this was a natural process or was somehow encouraged or accelerated by the Anunnaki, the result was the same. Humanity became divided into distinct cultural and linguistic groups. These groups spread across the known world, carrying with them the knowledge and practices they had learned, but developing their own unique expressions of civilization. In Egypt, a great civilization arose along the Nile, with its own pantheon of gods who may have been other Anunnaki or perhaps later mythologized humans. In the Indus Valley, sophisticated urban centers developed with advanced sanitation and city planning. In China, another distinct civilization emerged. Each of these cultures preserved stories that echo the Anunnaki narrative, though filtered through their own cultural lenses and historical experiences. They remembered gods who came from the sky, who taught humanity the arts of civilization, who sometimes intervened in human affairs. They built monuments that seem to require technological sophistication that scholars still debate. Massive stone structures aligned with astronomical precision that suggest either advanced knowledge or direct guidance from more advanced beings. Back in Mesopotamia, the heartland of the Anunnaki presence, human civilization continued to evolve. The city-states grew into regional powers. kings arose who claimed descent from the gods, using their divine ancestry to legitimize their rule. These rulers presided over increasingly complex societies with social stratification, specialized labor, and sophisticated cultural productions. Literature flourished. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving literary works, tells of a king of Uruk who was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. A warrior and builder whose friendship with the wild man Enkidu and subsequent quest for immortality explores timeless themes of mortality, friendship, and the meaning of life. This epic, written on clay tablets thousands of years ago, preserves within it older stories that may trace back to real events in the early post-flood period. Other texts from this period describe the deeds of various kings, the founding of cities, and the establishment of religious practices. They provide genealogies linking royal families back to the Anunnaki, creating a continuous chain from the gods to the current rulers. These weren't just propaganda, they reflected a worldview in which the divine and human realms were intimately connected. Religious practices became more elaborate. The ziggurats at the centres of major cities grew larger and more architecturally sophisticated. These weren't merely symbolic structures, they were functioning temples where priests performed daily rituals to honour and sustain the gods. The Sumerians believed that the gods needed to be fed, clothed and entertained, and enormous resources were devoted to these activities. The priesthood became a powerful institution in its own right. Priests were literate, educated in the temple schools, and served as intermediaries between the human population and the divine realm. They performed divination to understand the will of the gods, conducted sacrifices, maintained the sacred spaces, and often wielded significant political influence. High priests and priestesses, especially those serving the major deities, ranked among the most powerful people in their cities. Trade networks expanded, connecting distant regions. Merchants travelling overland and by sea carried not just goods but ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. Sumerian textiles, metalwork, and grain were exported, while precious materials like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, timber from Lebanon, and copper from various sources were imported. These trade connections created a web of interconnection across the ancient world. Writing evolved beyond its original administrative purposes to become a medium for literature, science, and personal expression. Letters were written between rulers, contracts were recorded, mathematical problems were explored, and myths were set down in permanent form. The invention of writing was perhaps the most transformative gift the Anunnaki gave humanity, for it allowed knowledge to accumulate across generations rather than being lost with each passing lifetime. But even as human civilization flourished, changes were occurring among the Anunnaki. The text suggests that gradually, perhaps over millennia, the Anunnaki began to withdraw from direct involvement in human affairs. The reasons aren't entirely clear from the ancient sources, but several factors may have contributed. One possibility is that the mission parameters changed. If gold shipments to Nibiru had achieved their purpose, or if contact with Nibiru had been lost, the primary reason for the Anunnaki presence on Earth would have ended. They might have decided to maintain a presence but on a reduced scale. Another factor could have been the simple passage of time. Generations of Anunnaki had lived and died on Earth. Their descendants, increasingly mixed with human genetic material through interbreeding, may have identified more as terrestrial beings than as representatives of a distant planet. The clear distinction between Anunnaki and human became increasingly blurred. There's also the possibility that internal conflicts among the Anunnaki escalated to the point where some left Earth entirely, returning to Nibiru or relocating to other parts of the solar system. Ancient texts mention conflicts involving devastating weapons, cities destroyed by fire from above, and regions made uninhabitable by something that sounds remarkably like radioactive contamination. Whether these accounts describe real events or mythologize natural disasters is debated, but they suggest a turbulent end to the Anunnaki's golden age on Earth. Whatever the reasons, the Anunnaki's direct presence diminished. They transitioned from visible rulers to more distant mythical figures. The gods who had once walked among humans, who had lived in the temples and directly governed the cities, became more remote. They still received worship and offerings, but their physical manifestations became rarer, eventually ceasing entirely. This transition period must have been confusing and perhaps traumatic for humanity. Beings who had been constant presences throughout all of history were gradually disappearing. The explanations given, preserved in various mythological cycles, often speak of the gods returning to their celestial realm, of choosing to distance themselves from humanity for various reasons, or of being called away to attend to cosmic matters beyond human understanding. Human rulers filled the power vacuum. Kings who had once clearly served at the pleasure of the Anunnaki now claimed divine authority in their own right. The concept of divine kingship evolved, with rulers positioned as intermediaries between the human and divine realms, responsible for maintaining cosmic order through proper ritual observance and just governance. This ideology would persist for millennia across many cultures. The memories of the Anunnaki, however, persisted. They were preserved in religious texts, in myths and legends, in the foundational stories that cultures told about their origins. The Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians and Assyrians, who successively dominated Mesopotamia, all maintained and built upon these ancient narratives. Later cultures, including the Hebrews who were influenced by their time in Babylonian exile, incorporated elements of these stories into their own religious traditions. The Book of Genesis, the opening book of the Hebrew Bible, contains clear parallels to the older Sumerian and Babylonian texts. The creation story, the Garden of Eden, the flood narrative, the Tower of Babel, all of these have antecedents in the earlier Mesopotamian traditions that speak of the Anunnaki. Scholars recognize these connections, debating the extent of direct borrowing versus independent development of similar themes. The Nephilim appear in biblical text as the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, described as mighty warriors and men of renown. This mirrors the Anunnaki text's descriptions of the hybrid offspring of divine human unions. The role of the serpent in the Garden of Eden story may connect to Enki, who was associated with snakes, and who, in the older texts, often work to give humanity knowledge against the wishes of other Anunnaki. Even the monotheistic revolution that would later sweep through the ancient world can be understood in the context of the Anunnaki story. The transition from polytheism to monotheism, the insistence that there is only one god rather than many gods, might represent a later theological development that sought to unify the various Anunnaki figures into a single divine entity, or to elevate one particular Anunnaki above all others and deny the divinity of the rest. The archaeological record supports many elements of the Anunnaki story, even if not in the literal way true believers might prefer. The ancient Sumerian civilization was indeed remarkably advanced for its time, showing sudden developments in writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and urban planning that seem to appear with surprising speed and sophistication. Some scholars argue this suggests external influence or intervention, though mainstream archaeology explains it through more conventional models of cultural evolution. Ancient mining sites in Africa date back much further than was once believed possible, with some evidence suggesting sophisticated mining operations tens of thousands of years ago. While this doesn't prove that the Anunnaki were overseeing gold extraction, it does confirm that our ancestors were mining on impressive scales in the deep past. The flood narrative is supported by geological evidence of catastrophic flooding events in the ancient past, though the timing and extent are debated. Many coastal regions were indeed inundated as Ice Age glaciers melted, and there may have been periods of sudden, dramatic sea level rise that would have appeared apocalyptic to the populations experiencing them. Whether any single flood event matches the biblical or Sumerian descriptions remains uncertain. The ziggurats themselves still stand in some places, eroded but recognizable, testaments to the architectural ambition of ancient civilizations. These massive structures required sophisticated understanding of engineering, mathematics and organization. They embodied the connection between earth and heaven that was so central to ancient Mesopotamian religion. Artifacts recovered from ancient sites include cylinder seals with intricate carvings, many depicting figures that could be interpreted as the Anunnaki. Some show humanoid beings with wings or other features suggesting they're not quite human. Others display scenes of rituals, processions, and what might be technological devices, though interpretations of these images vary wildly depending on one's perspective. The textual evidence is substantial. Thousands of clay tablets have been recovered and translated, providing detailed information about Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian beliefs about their gods. While mainstream scholars interpret these texts as mythology and religious literature, alternative researchers see in them historical records of actual events, encoded in the language and conceptual frameworks available to ancient scribes. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes a cosmic battle between gods that results in the creation of Earth and humanity. The Atrahasis epic provides detailed accounts of human creation and the flood. The Epic of Gilgamesh includes encounters between humans and divine beings. The Sumerian king list documents rulers who supposedly reigned for impossibly long periods before the flood, followed by more realistic lifespans afterward. These texts are not primitive or simplistic. They display sophisticated narrative structures, complex characterizations, and philosophical depth. The ancient scribes who composed and preserved them were educated, thoughtful individuals grappling with fundamental questions about existence, the relationship between humanity and the divine, and the nature of civilization itself. Modern interest in the Anunnaki story was revitalized in the 20th century, particularly through the work of researchers like Zecharia Sitchin. Sitchin's translations and interpretations of Sumerian texts, while controversial and rejected by mainstream academics, introduced millions of readers to the concept of ancient astronauts and the Anunnaki narrative. His books argued that the Sumerian texts should be read as historical records rather than mythology, describing actual alien beings from a planet called Nibiru. Critics point out numerous problems with Sitchin's work, including questionable translation choices, selective use of evidence, and interpretations that don't align with scholarly consensus. However, his ideas resonated with many who felt that mainstream archaeology couldn't adequately explain certain ancient mysteries or who were open to the possibility of extraterrestrial contact in humanity's past. The ancient astronaut theory, more broadly, popularized by writers like Erich von Däniken, suggests that many ancient monuments, religious traditions, and technological achievements were influenced by visiting extraterrestrial beings. Proponents point to architectural marvels like the pyramids, megalithic structures like Stonehenge, the Nazca Lines, and numerous other sites as evidence of advanced knowledge that ancient humans supposedly couldn't have possessed independently. Mainstream archaeology and anthropology push back against these theories, arguing that they underestimate ancient human intelligence and ingenuity. They point out that given sufficient time, labour and motivation, humans with Stone Age or Bronze Age technology could and did create remarkable structures and achieve impressive feats of engineering. They argue that attributing these achievements to aliens is both unnecessary and disrespectful to our ancestors. Yet the debate continues, fueled by genuinely puzzling aspects of the ancient world. How did ancient cultures separated by vast distances develop similar myths and architectural styles? Why do so many ancient traditions speak of beings who came from the sky or stars? How did the Sumerians seemingly develop advanced knowledge of astronomy, including awareness of planets not visible to the naked eye? These questions don't necessarily require the Anunnaki hypothesis to answer them, but they do remind us that human prehistory contains mysteries we have yet to fully unravel. The standard model of human development, while supported by substantial evidence, still has gaps and uncertainties, particularly regarding the earliest periods of civilization. Consider the timeline. Anatomically, modern humans appeared perhaps 300,000 years ago. For the vast majority of that time, humans lived as hunter-gatherers in small nomadic groups. Then, beginning around 12,000 years ago, we see the sudden development of agriculture, followed relatively quickly by urbanization, writing, complex social structures, and all the hallmarks of civilization. This transition seems remarkably rapid compared to the hundreds of thousands of years that preceded it. Standard explanations focus on environmental changes, particularly the end of the last ice age, which created more stable conditions favourable for agriculture. They point to population pressures and the gradual accumulation of knowledge as drivers of innovation. These are plausible, evidence-based explanations that don't require external intervention. But the Anunnaki narrative offers an alternative framework. Civilization appeared relatively suddenly because it was taught to humanity by more advanced beings, rather than being developed entirely independently. The genetic manipulation described in the texts might explain the relatively rapid evolutionary changes that produced modern human cognition. The flood story might preserve memories of an actual catastrophe that reset human civilization, requiring a new beginning. Neither interpretation can be definitively proven with current evidence, which leaves room for ongoing speculation and debate. For some, the ancient texts are merely mythology, valuable as cultural artifacts and windows into ancient worldviews, but not to be taken as historical records. For others, they represent distorted but genuine memories of actual events, encoded in the language and concepts available to ancient peoples. What remains undeniable is the profound influence these ancient stories have had on human civilization. The myths of Mesopotamia shaped the worldviews of the peoples who inhabited that region for millennia. They influenced Greek and Roman thought as classical scholars engaged with Near Eastern traditions. They were incorporated into the Abrahamic religions that would come to dominate much of the world, and in modern times they continue to inspire, whether as religious tradition, literary sources, or fuel for speculation about humanity's origins. The themes explored in the Anunnaki Chronicles remain relevant. Questions about creation and purpose, about the relationship between the powerful and the powerless, about the responsibilities that come with knowledge and technology, about the meaning of being human. These ancient texts grappled with issues that still concern us today. The character of Enki, in particular, resonates through the ages as a figure of complexity and depth. He is a creator who cares for his creation, who repeatedly intervenes to help humanity even when it puts him at odds with authority and order. He represents the principle of compassion and wisdom, the idea that knowledge should be shared and that conscious beings deserve protection and respect. In many ways, Enki embodies traits we still value: ingenuity, kindness, a questioning of unjust authority. Enlil, his counterpart, represents different but equally recognizable principles: order, hierarchy, the rule of law, the sometimes harsh necessities of governance. He's not purely villainous in the texts, but rather someone who genuinely believes that structure and discipline are necessary for civilization to function. The conflict between these two brothers reflects an eternal human tension between freedom and order, between mercy and justice, between the individual and the system. Humanity itself, in these ancient narratives, occupies an interesting position. Created to serve but gifted with consciousness and increasingly with knowledge, humans are caught between their designed purpose and their emerging autonomy. The story of human development in the Anunnaki Chronicles is one of gradual emancipation, of growing from worker servants into beings capable of self-governance and sophisticated culture. This narrative arc mirrors what we know of actual human history in some ways. Our distant ancestors were indeed less cognitively sophisticated than we are. Over time, humans developed more complex languages, more elaborate social structures, more advanced technologies. We moved from being entirely at the mercy of our environment to becoming the dominant species on the planet, capable of reshaping landscapes and, for better or worse, affecting global climate and ecosystems. Whether this development occurred entirely through natural evolution and cultural development, or whether it was influenced by external intelligence as the Anunnaki story suggests, we became something remarkable. A species capable of asking questions about our own origins, of developing science and philosophy, of creating art and literature, of reaching beyond our planet to explore the cosmos. The ancient Sumerians, sitting in their cities 5,000 years ago, could not have imagined the world we inhabit today. They did not know about evolution, genetics, astronomy as we understand it, or the true vastness of the universe. Their conceptual frameworks were different from ours, shaped by their experiences and the knowledge available to them. Yet they asked the same fundamental questions we still ask. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What is our relationship to the forces greater than ourselves? Their answers, preserved in the texts that speak of the Anunnaki, reflect their attempt to make sense of their existence and their history. Whether we interpret those answers as literal history, as mythology encoding deeper truths, or as ancient science fiction, they represent a significant human intellectual achievement. They show us that our ancestors were thoughtful, creative, and concerned with profound questions. The legacy of the Anunnaki, whether they were real alien beings, mythologized human rulers, or entirely symbolic representations of natural and cosmic forces, is woven into the foundations of human civilization. The city-states they supposedly established became the template for urban centers. The knowledge they purportedly shared formed the basis of early science, mathematics, and technology. The social and religious structures associated with them influenced how humans organized themselves for millennia. Today, we live in a world that would be incomprehensible to the ancient Sumerians, yet we still grapple with many of the same issues their texts addressed. We debate the ethics of genetic engineering, echoing ancient concerns about creating new forms of life. We worry about environmental catastrophe, much as the flood narrative speaks to fears of world-ending disasters. We struggle with questions of authority and autonomy, repeating the ancient tension between divine command and human independence. Some people today take the Anunnaki story quite literally, believing that Nibiru is a real planet on a long elliptical orbit that will eventually return to the inner solar system, that the Anunnaki were and perhaps still are real extraterrestrial beings, and that much of what mainstream science and history teach us is either mistaken or deliberately concealing the truth. They see evidence of the Anunnaki in ancient ruins, in anomalous artifacts, in gaps in the archaeological record, and in the similarities between ancient cultures separated by great distances. Others view the story as essentially mythological but still meaningful. They see in the Anunnaki narratives archetypal patterns that reveal psychological truths about human nature and our relationship with the unknown, with power, and with our own potential. From this perspective, whether the Anunnaki literally existed matters less than what the stories tell us about ourselves and the questions that have always driven human inquiry. Still others dismiss the Anunnaki story as pseudoscience and pseudo-history, arguing that we should focus on evidence-based archaeology and anthropology to understand our past. They see ancient astronaut theories as unhelpful distractions that promote conspiracy thinking and undermine respect for both ancient human capabilities and modern scientific methods. Each perspective has something to offer. The literal believers push us to question assumptions and consider possibilities we might otherwise dismiss. The symbolic interpreters remind us that not all truth is literal, and that myths can convey deep insights regardless of their historical accuracy. The skeptics keep us grounded, insisting on evidence and rigorous thinking, preventing speculation from detaching entirely from reality. Perhaps the truth, as is often the case, contains elements of multiple perspectives. The ancient Sumerians clearly experienced or knew about something remarkable that they encoded in their texts. Whether that something was actual extraterrestrial contact, culturally significant historical events that became mythologized, profound religious or mystical experiences, or the natural creativity of human storytelling combined with the urge to explain the world, we may never know with certainty. What we can say is that the Anunnaki Chronicles represent humanity's earliest systematic attempt to write down our understanding of where we came from and how we got here. They show us that the questions we ask today are not new, that humans have always wondered about creation, purpose, the divine, and our place in the cosmos. They demonstrate that our ancestors were capable of abstract thought, complex narrative, and sophisticated attempts to understand reality. The clay tablets on which these stories were recorded have survived millennia. They've outlasted the civilization that created them, outlasted empires and kingdoms, outlasted countless generations. They've been buried and rediscovered, translated and debated, inspiring both devotion and skepticism. In their survival, they testify to the human desire to communicate across time, to leave a record of our thoughts and beliefs for future generations to ponder. As you drift towards sleep, consider the vast span of time these stories bridge. From the moment they were first told, perhaps orally for generations before being written down, to their recording in cuneiform on clay, to their burial and preservation in the earth, to their modern excavation and translation, to this moment as you hear them recounted, these narratives have travelled an immense journey. They connect us to people who lived 5,000 years ago, people who looked up at the same stars we see, who wondered about the same mysteries, who hoped and feared and dreamed not so differently from how we do today. The specifics of their lives were radically different from ours, but the fundamental human experiences of wonder, curiosity, love, fear, and the search for meaning transcend those differences. Whether the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials, gods, mythical beings, or something else entirely, the stories told about them reflect humanity's perennial concerns. They speak to our sense that there is something greater than ourselves. Whether we understand that as God, gods, advanced alien civilizations, the universe itself, or simply the accumulated wisdom and potential of humanity as a whole, they explore the tension between our humble origins and our grand aspirations, between our limitations and our possibilities. The journey from primitive worker servants to the creators of sophisticated civilizations mirrors our actual historical development in many ways. We began with so little, our earliest ancestors struggling to survive in a world full of dangers, possessing only the most basic tools. Yet through ingenuity, cooperation, and the accumulation of knowledge across generations, we built cities, created art, developed science, and eventually reached beyond our planet to explore the cosmos. That journey continues. We are still becoming, still developing our potential, still learning and growing. The questions the ancient Sumerians asked remain partially unanswered. We don't fully understand consciousness, the origin of life, our ultimate fate, or whether we're alone in the universe. We've learned vast amounts, but vast amounts remain unknown. Perhaps that uncertainty is itself meaningful. The Anunnaki story doesn't provide easy answers or simple truths. It presents a complex narrative where beings with tremendous power nonetheless struggle with difficult choices, where creation itself is messy and morally ambiguous, where conflicts between different values and priorities drive events. This complexity mirrors reality better than stories with clear heroes and villains, with simple moral lessons and obvious meanings. In the silence of the night, as your conscious thoughts begin to dissolve and sleep approaches, the boundary between history and myth, between literal truth and symbolic meaning, becomes less important. The story itself becomes what matters, the narrative arc that carries you from creation through catastrophe to the building of civilization. The characters and their struggles become companions in your imagination, ancient figures who nonetheless feel somehow familiar. Enki, the creator and protector, working behind the scenes to save humanity from destruction. Enlil, the enforcer of cosmic order, insisting on rules and hierarchies even when they seem harsh. Ninhursag, the mother figure, mourning the destruction of her creations yet participating in the systems that govern them. Ziusudra, the faithful human who trusts in divine guidance and saves his world through obedience and perseverance. These archetypes recur throughout human storytelling because they represent aspects of the human experience, patterns we recognize and respond to. The flood itself, that great catastrophe that destroyed and renewed, serves as a metaphor for the cycles of death and rebirth that characterize existence at every scale. Civilizations rise and fall. Individuals are born and die. Ideas emerge, flourish and fade. Nothing is permanent, yet nothing is truly lost, for each ending contains within it the seeds of new beginnings. The world that emerged after the flood was different from what came before, but it grew from the same soil, carried forward by survivors who remembered what had been and worked to build something new. Humanity's relationship with its creators, however we understand creators, reflects our ongoing negotiation with forces beyond our control or full understanding. Whether those forces are divine beings, natural laws, biological imperatives, or social structures, we are all in some sense created by things we didn't choose, shaped by circumstances not of our making. Yet we also possess agency, the ability to make choices, to shape our own destinies within the constraints we face. The gift of knowledge that Enki gave humanity in the Anunnaki stories, often portrayed as going against the wishes of higher authorities, mirrors the ambivalence we feel about knowledge and progress. Knowledge empowers us, allows us to solve problems and improve our conditions, but it also brings responsibility and the potential for misuse. The more we know, the more choices we must make, and the weightier the consequences of those choices become. Our ancestors understood this ambivalence. Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, the serpent in Eden offering the fruit of knowledge, Enki teaching forbidden arts to humanity. These stories all explore the same theme. There is something dangerous about knowledge, something that changes us fundamentally, yet something we cannot and should not refuse. To be human is to seek understanding, even when that understanding complicates our existence. As your mind drifts further towards sleep, the specific details of the Anunnaki story may become less distinct, but the emotional and thematic currents remain. There is something comforting in these ancient narratives, in knowing that humans have always told stories to make sense of the world, have always reached for understanding beyond what they could directly observe or prove. We are part of a tradition stretching back thousands of years, asking the same questions, struggling with the same mysteries. The night sky that stretches above you held the same stars the ancient Sumerians observed, though their positions have shifted slightly over the millennia. They watched those stars and saw the movements of gods, the patterns that governed earthly events, the home of divine beings. We watch them and see distant suns, other solar systems, galaxies containing billions of stars, an unimaginably vast universe that makes our Earth seem tiny and insignificant yet precious in its rarity as a home for life. Both perspectives contain truth. The universe is vast beyond comprehension, and we occupy a tiny corner of it. Yet this tiny corner is where we exist, where all human history has unfolded, where every person we've ever known has lived and died. The cosmic perspective humbles us, but it needn't diminish us. Perhaps the Anunnaki, if they existed, came to realise this too, seeing in humanity something worth preserving and nurturing despite our small scale compared to cosmic immensity. The ancient ziggurats, built to connect earth and heaven, embody that dual perspective. They were rooted in the earth, built from mud bricks formed from the very soil of Mesopotamia, yet they reached toward the sky, toward the realm of the gods. They stood at the boundary between the terrestrial and the celestial, between the human and the divine. In their architecture, they expressed a truth that remains relevant. We are creatures of the earth, but our thoughts and aspirations reach beyond it. Let your thoughts drift like clouds, carrying fragments of the ancient story. Images float by. Massive gold mines in ancient Africa, humans and Anunnaki working side by side. Enki in his laboratory, carefully combining genetic material to create something new. The Great Flood, walls of water consuming everything. The Ark riding the waves, carrying its precious cargo of life. Ziusudra standing on a mountaintop as the waters recede, surveying a transformed world. The slow rebuilding, cities rising from the mud, humanity beginning again with new knowledge and new purpose. These images are not demands on your attention, merely companions as you transition from waking consciousness to sleep. Let them flow past without grasping at them, without trying to analyse or remember. They are part of the great human story, the narrative we have collectively woven across thousands of generations. You are part of that story too, a thread in the vast tapestry, connected backward to your ancestors and forward to descendants you will never know. The Anunnaki themselves, whether real or mythical, served a purpose in their story. They explained the world as the ancient Sumerians experienced it. They gave meaning to the struggles and achievements of early civilization. They connected human history to cosmic events and divine purposes. They made the universe feel less empty, less indifferent, by populating it with conscious beings who cared about Earth and humanity, even if their care was mixed with other motivations. We still seek that same reassurance today, the sense that the universe is not entirely cold and meaningless, that consciousness is not a cosmic accident of no significance. Whether we look for that in traditional religion, in speculation about extraterrestrial intelligence, in philosophical frameworks that give meaning to existence, or in the connections we form with each other, the impulse is the same one that led the Sumerians to tell stories of the Anunnaki. Perhaps there is wisdom in the ancient approach, in expressing profound truths through story, rather than trying to reduce everything to dry facts and abstract theories. Stories engage our whole being, not just our intellect. They speak to emotions, to imagination, to intuition. The story of the Anunnaki, whether historically accurate or not, conveys truths about human nature, about our relationship with power and knowledge, about our resilience and adaptability, about our eternal questioning of where we came from and why we're here. As sleep draws near, these reflections fade into something less defined, more dreamlike. The boundary between the ancient story and your own thoughts dissolves. You might find yourself in ancient Sumer, walking through a city where humans and gods mingle, or observing from above as civilizations rise and fall in an accelerated dance through time. Or you might simply sink into darkness, into the deep rest that doesn't require narratives or meanings, just the simple piece of consciousness temporarily released from its constant activity. The Anunnaki Chronicles have fulfilled their purpose for tonight, carrying you from full wakefulness through the liminal space of drowsiness towards sleep. The ancient story, told and retold across millennia, has once again served as a companion for a mind-seeking rest, offering familiar patterns and profound questions that somehow soothe, even as they stimulate thought. Rest now. The mysteries will still be there tomorrow, ready to be pondered anew. The questions humanity has asked for thousands of years don't require immediate answers. Some questions are more valuable for the asking than for any answer we might find. Some stories serve us best not by being definitively true or false, but by being endlessly interesting, endlessly evocative of wonder and contemplation. The night embraces you, vast and dark and full of potential, much like the cosmic void from which the Anunnaki supposedly emerged so long ago. In that darkness, consciousness gradually releases its grip, allowing you to drift into dreams where ancient gods and modern concerns might mingle in ways that make no logical sense yet feel somehow right in dream logic. Sleep well, traveller. The ancient story continues its own journey through time, preserved now not just in clay tablets, but in digital form, in the collective, human imagination, in conversations and retellings that span the globe. You've touched that story tonight, added your awareness to the countless minds that have engaged with it over the millennia. In doing so, you've participated in something larger than yourself, connected yourself to the great human project of understanding where we come from and what we might become. The Anunnaki, whether they were alien visitors from Nibiru, ancient rulers who became mythologized, or entirely symbolic representations of forces and principles, have served their purpose once again. They've carried a mind from the concerns of the present day back into the deep past, through stories of creation and catastrophe, through the building of civilization and the dawn of human potential. They've reminded us that our questions are ancient, our curiosity eternal, our place in the cosmos both humble and remarkable. As consciousness fades and sleep finally claims you, perhaps you'll dream of ziggurats reaching toward star-filled skies, of beings who came from above and changed everything, of floods that destroyed worlds and survivors who rebuilt them, of knowledge passed from gods to humans, of the eternal dance between order and chaos, between limitation and potential, between what we are and what we might become. The ancient Sumerians who first told these stories are long gone, their cities buried, their empire fallen, their very language dead and requiring modern scholars to painstakingly reconstruct it. But their stories survive, adapted and reinterpreted by each generation that encounters them, eternally relevant because they speak to something fundamental in the human experience. Sweet dreams, seeker of ancient wisdom, may your rest be peaceful, and your dreams carry you to interesting places. The story of the Anunnaki, and the larger story of humanity that it reflects, continues tomorrow and all the tomorrows after, an endless narrative still being written, still unfolding, still full of surprises and mysteries yet to be revealed. For now, simply rest, secure in the knowledge that you're part of something vast and meaningful, a conscious being in a universe that somehow, impossibly, gave rise to consciousness and allowed it to ponder its own existence. The silence of deep night settles around you now, that particular quality of stillness that exists in the hours when most of the world sleeps. We continue our journey through the Anunnaki Chronicles, delving deeper into the mysteries and implications of this ancient narrative that has captivated imaginations across millennia. Let us return to the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, to those remarkable urban centres that arose in the aftermath of the Great Flood. These were not crude settlements, but sophisticated metropolises that would have impressed even modern observers with their organisation, their architecture, and their cultural achievements. The Anunnaki, according to the texts, had established a pattern, a template, for civilization that humanity would follow and elaborate upon for thousands of years. Each major city had its own character, its own patron deity from among the Anunnaki, and its own specializations. Eridu, the city of Enki, was renowned for its scholars and magicians, those who studied the deepest mysteries of existence. The temple of Enki, called the I-Abzu, or House of the Cosmic Waters, was said to sit above underground springs that connected to the Abzu, the primordial waters of creation. Here, the priests of Enki performed rituals and studied texts that preserved ancient knowledge. Imagine walking through Eridu in its glory days. The streets would have been busy with activity despite the heat of the Mesopotamian sun. Merchants would call out their wares, selling grain, dates, fish from the nearby marshes, textiles woven in intricate patterns, pottery both practical and decorative. The air would smell of bread baking, of incense from the temples, of the distinctive odour of the canals that brought water from the Euphrates to irrigate the fields and supply the city. The people themselves would have been diverse, ranging from slaves captured in warfare to wealthy merchants to priests in their distinctive garments, to scribes carrying clay tablets. Their clothing would have been primarily linen, simple tunics for workers, more elaborate robes for the elite. Both men and women might wear jewellery, rings and necklaces and earrings, often inscribed with prayers or symbols of protection. But dominating everything, visible from anywhere in the city, would have been the great ziggurat, the stepped pyramid that served as both temple and cosmic mountain. Its mud brick walls might have been whitewashed or painted in brilliant colours. Stairs or ramps would lead upward through successive levels, each terrace perhaps planted with gardens, creating a green mountain rising from the flat plain. At the very top would sit the small shrine, the dwelling place of Enki himself when he chose to manifest in his city. Only the highest priests could enter that uppermost sanctuary. They would climb the stairs in solemn procession, carrying offerings of food and drink, precious objects, perhaps animals for sacrifice. They believed, truly believed, that Enki was present there, that the statue that represented him was not merely a symbol, but was somehow imbued with the god's essence. They would perform the daily rituals of feeding, clothing, and entertaining the deity, essential acts that maintained cosmic order and ensured the city's prosperity. What did they experience in those moments? Did the most sensitive among them genuinely feel a presence, something beyond themselves? Were there times when the rituals seemed to work in ways that defied normal explanation? When prayers were answered too specifically to be coincidence? When the statue seemed to move or speak? The texts sometimes hint at such experiences, at direct encounters between priests and the divine that transformed them. We must remember that for the ancient Sumerians, the line between the physical and spiritual realms was much more permeable than it is for most modern people. They lived in a world that was alive with meaning, where every natural phenomenon might be a message from the gods, where dreams carried prophetic weight, where the positions of stars and planets influenced earthly events. This wasn't superstition to them, but simply how reality worked. If we step back and try to understand this worldview, we might find it less alien than it first appears. Even today we recognize that consciousness is mysterious, that subjective experience is real even when it can't be objectively measured, that meaning and purpose matter even in a materialistic universe. The Sumerians simply had a different framework for understanding these aspects of existence, one that personified the forces they couldn't control and attributed consciousness to natural phenomena. But let us move to Nippur, the city of Enlil, the administrative and religious centre of the Sumerian world. Nippur was never a political capital in the way we might think of capitals today, with kings ruling from there. Instead, it was the spiritual heart of the civilization, the city where Enlil held court, and where the fates of other cities were determined in the assembly of the gods. The temple complex in Nippur, called the Ekur, or Mountain House, was even more impressive than Eridu's ziggurat. This was the place where the tablets of destiny were kept, the divine records that determined the fate of all things. According to the myths, whoever possessed these tablets held ultimate power, and various stories tell of attempts by different gods or mythical beings to steal them. In more prosaic terms, Nippur was likely where the central archives were kept. The records of treaties between cities, the genealogies of ruling families, the astronomical observations that allowed for accurate calendars, the legal precedents that governed disputes. The priests of Nippur, serving Enlil, were the administrators of the Sumerian world, the bureaucrats who kept civilization functioning. Enlil himself was portrayed with great complexity in the texts. He was the storm god, associated with the wind and weather, with the power to bring both life-giving rains and destructive tempests. He was the enforcer of cosmic law, the one who punished transgressions and maintained order. But he was also shown as capable of anger, of harsh judgments, of decisions that seemed cruel even to the other gods. The relationship between Enlil and humanity was always more distant and formal than that between Enki and humanity. Enlil demanded respect, obedience, and proper observance of rituals. He was not interested in humanity's individual struggles or dreams, but in their aggregate behaviour, in whether they fulfilled their functions in the cosmic order. In some ways, Enlil represented the impersonal forces of civilization itself, the structures and hierarchies that enable large-scale social organisation, but that can also feel oppressive to individuals within them. The tension between Enki and Enlil, which runs throughout the ancient texts, can be understood on multiple levels. On the literal level, they were two brothers with different personalities and philosophies, often at odds. On a symbolic level, they represented different aspects of existence. Enki as wisdom, creativity, and individual compassion. Enlil as law, order, and collective structure. Both were necessary, and the dynamic tension between them drove events forward. This tension played out in the cities themselves. A city might primarily honour Enki, adopting his values of learning and magic, becoming a centre of scholarship and innovation. Another might align more with Enlil, emphasising law, military discipline, and rigid social hierarchies. These weren't absolute divisions, all gods were honoured everywhere, but each city had its own character influenced by its patron deity. Then there was Inanna, later known as Ishtar in Akkadian tradition, one of the most fascinating and complex figures in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Inanna was associated with love, beauty, sex, desire, fertility, war, combat, and political power. She was the patron goddess of Kuruk, one of the greatest Sumerian cities, and possibly the world's first true metropolis. Inanna was portrayed as passionate, ambitious, and sometimes reckless. The myths show her as willing to challenge authority, to descend into the underworld in pursuit of power, to use her sexuality as a weapon, to fight alongside warriors in battle. She was simultaneously the goddess of the marriage bed and the battlefield, uniting aspects of existence that many cultures prefer to keep separate. The famous Epic of Gilgamesh includes a significant episode involving Inanna. Gilgamesh, the semi-divine king of Uruk, rejects Inanna's sexual advances, insulting her by recounting the fates of her previous lovers. Enraged, she demands that her father Anu send the bull of heaven to destroy Gilgamesh and Uruk. Anu reluctantly agrees, and the bull descends to wreak havoc, but Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu manage to slay it, further insulting Inanna. This story, while seemingly about personal drama, actually explores profound themes about the relationship between mortals and immortals, about hubris and its consequences, about the autonomy of humans in the face of divine desires. Gilgamesh's rejection of Inanna represents humanity asserting its right to self-determination, refusing to simply submit to divine whim. Yet there are consequences. Enkidu eventually dies as punishment for killing the bull of heaven, and Gilgamesh is left to grapple with mortality and loss. The death of Enkidu is one of the most moving passages in ancient literature. Gilgamesh's grief is portrayed with raw emotional power that still resonates thousands of years later. He refuses to accept that his beloved friend is truly gone, sitting with the corpse for days until he finally sees a worm fall from Enkidu's nostril, a grotesque detail that forces him to confront the reality of death. This moment of recognition, of finally accepting that death is real and final, drives the remainder of the epic. Gilgamesh then embarks on a quest for immortality, seeking out the one human who had been granted eternal life, Utnapishtim, the Sumerian equivalent of Ziusudra or Noah. Gilgamesh journeys to the ends of the earth, crossing the waters of death, enduring trials that would kill lesser mortals, driven by his terror of death and his desperate hope that he might avoid the fate that claimed Enkidu. When he finally reaches Utnapishtim and hears the story of the Great Flood, Gilgamesh learns that the immortality granted to the flood survivor was a unique circumstance, a one-time exception that cannot be repeated. The gods are not going to destroy the world again, so there will be no opportunity for another human to earn immortality through survival. Death, Utnapishtim tells him, is the common fate of humanity, the price of being mortal. But Utnapishtim, moved by Gilgamesh's journey, does tell him of a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, a plant that can restore youth, if not grant true immortality. Gilgamesh dives deep into the waters, retrieves the plant despite its thorns that cut his hands, and begins his journey home, planning to test the plant on an old man in Uruk before using it himself. But while he bathes in a pool, a serpent steals the plant and eats it, immediately shedding its skin and becoming young again. This is why, the story explains, snakes can shed their skins and renew themselves while humans cannot. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed, having failed in his quest for immortality. But the epic ends not with despair, but with a kind of reconciliation. Gilgamesh shows his companion the walls of Uruk, the great city he has built, the works that will outlast his mortal body. His immortality, the text suggests, lies not in escaping death but in his achievements, in what he creates and builds that will endure after he is gone. This shift in perspective, from seeking personal immortality to finding meaning in legacy and accomplishment, represents a profound philosophical development. It acknowledges death as inevitable, while asserting that life still has meaning, that what we do matters even if we personally are finite. This is a very human wisdom, hard-won through confronting mortality honestly, rather than through comforting fantasies of escape. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed more than 4,000 years ago, still speaks to modern readers because it grapples with experiences and questions that remain relevant. We still lose people we love and must learn to accept that loss. We still fear death and search for meaning in the face of our mortality. We still seek to balance the demands of leadership and duty with friendship and personal connection. The specifics of Gilgamesh's world are alien to us, but his emotional journey is universal. Now let us consider the role of women in these ancient societies and narratives. While the civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia were patriarchal in many ways, with men dominating most positions of power, the picture is more complex than simple male domination. Women could own property, engage in business, serve as priestesses, and in some cases wield considerable power. The goddesses of the Mesopotamian pantheon were powerful figures, not merely consorts or appendages to male gods. Inanna Ishtar was a major deity in her own right, sometimes portrayed as more powerful than many male gods. Ninhursag was honoured as the mother goddess, the genetic engineer who had helped create humanity. Ereshkigal ruled the underworld with absolute authority. These female deities had their own domains, their own temples, their own priesthoods. High priestesses, particularly those serving Inanna, held significant religious and sometimes political power. The enter priestesses, for instance, were often daughters of kings, dedicated to divine service, but also serving as important links between royal authority and religious legitimacy. They performed crucial rituals, maintained temple estates, and participated in the sacred marriage ceremonies that were believed to ensure fertility and prosperity. The sacred marriage ritual itself is worth exploring. In this ceremony, performed annually in many cities, the king would ritually marry the high priestess of Inanna, who represented the goddess herself. The ceremony included actual or symbolic sexual union, believed to bless the land with fertility, to renew the king's divine mandate, and to ensure good harvests. This wasn't crude sexual magic, but a sophisticated theological concept about the connections between different realms of existence, the divine and human, the cosmic and terrestrial. In the context of the Anunnaki narrative, we might understand these rituals as dim echoes of earlier times, when Anunnaki and humans actually did intermarry and produce hybrid offspring. The sacred marriage could be a formalized, symbolic reenactment of relationships that had once been literal, or it might simply reflect universal human tendencies to ritualize sexuality and to link human fertility with agricultural abundance. The status of women in Mesopotamian society varied considerably over time and between different cities and periods. Earlier Sumerian society appears to have granted women more rights and autonomy than later Babylonian and Assyrian cultures. Women could be scribes, though rarely. They could be merchants and tavern keepers. They could initiate divorce under certain circumstances. They could testify in legal proceedings. Yet women were also subject to various restrictions and controls. Their sexuality was more regulated than men's. Honour codes often placed the burden of maintaining family reputation on women's. Chastity. Women could be given as tribute or taken as spoils of war. The legal codes, while granting women some rights, clearly operated within patriarchal frameworks that privileged male authority. The creation of humanity in the Anunnaki narrative involved both male and female principles. Enki provided the technical knowledge, but Ninhursag was equally essential, perhaps more so. The actual process of creation involved female Anunnaki serving as birth goddesses, carrying the hybrid embryos. This gives women a central role in the origin story, as the literal bearers of a new species into existence. Yet the subsequent development of civilization involved male Anunnaki, making most of the decisions about humanity's fate. Enki and Enlil debate what to do about human population growth, with Ninhursag mostly absent from these crucial discussions. The assembly of the gods that decides to allow the flood is dominated by male deities. This reflects the patriarchal nature of the societies that recorded these texts, though we might wonder if earlier, less filtered versions of the stories granted female deities more active roles. Let us turn now to the question of technology in the ancient world. The Anunnaki narrative, particularly as interpreted by ancient astronaut theorists, suggests that ancient humans had access to advanced technology through their contact with the Anunnaki. The evidence for this is ambiguous and hotly debated. Mainstream archaeology explains ancient achievements through conventional means: human ingenuity, trial and error, abundant labour, and time. The pyramids of Egypt, for instance, could have been built using Bronze Age technology, wooden sledges, ramps, levers, and enormous numbers of workers organised efficiently. Experiments have shown that relatively simple techniques can move and position massive stones with precision. Yet some anomalies persist that puzzle researchers. The precision of ancient stonework in places like Pumapunku in Bolivia, or the underground chambers at the Serapeum of Saqqara in Egypt, seems extraordinarily difficult to achieve with the tools we believe were available. The astronomical knowledge encoded in ancient structures suggests sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. Ancient texts sometimes describe devices and weapons that sound remarkably like modern, or even futuristic technology. Consider the ancient batteries found near Baghdad, clay jars containing copper cylinders and iron rods that, when filled with acidic liquid, can generate electric current. Were these actually used for electroplating or some other electrical application, or do they have more mundane explanations? The debate continues. Or consider the Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera. This device, dating to around 100 BCE, is an extraordinarily sophisticated astronomical calculator with dozens of bronze gears precisely cut and assembled to predict the positions of celestial bodies. Nothing of comparable complexity appears in the archaeological record again until medieval European clockwork, over 1,000 years later. If the Greeks could build this, what else were ancient peoples capable of that has been lost? The ancient texts sometimes describe flying machines. The Vedic texts from India speak of vimanas, flying vehicles used by gods and heroes. Some descriptions are clearly mythological, but others provide technical details about construction and operation that seem oddly specific. Similarly, the biblical book of Ezekiel describes the prophet's vision of a wheeled craft descending from the sky, with details that some have interpreted as describing a spacecraft. Weapons in ancient texts sometimes sound remarkably like modern armaments. The Mahabharata, the great Indian epic, describes weapons that create enormous explosions, generate terrible heat, and leave areas uninhabitable for years afterward. Descriptions that sound disturbingly like nuclear weapons. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in biblical text involves fire from the sky, and warnings not to look back at the explosion, similar to modern nuclear safety protocols. Are these descriptions of actual advanced technology, or are they simply imagination, religious vision, or the mythologization of natural disasters like volcanic eruptions or meteor impacts? Without physical evidence of the devices described, we cannot know for certain, but the persistence of such accounts across different cultures and time periods is at least intriguing. The Anunnaki texts specifically mention devices and capabilities that sound technological. Enki is described as possessing the ME, mysterious objects or information that granted knowledge of various arts and sciences. Inanna steals some of these ME from Enki while he is drunk, securing knowledge for her city of Uruk. The texts treat the ME as tangible objects that can be stolen, transferred, or lost. What were the ME? Scholars generally interpret them as abstract concepts or divine decrees, the essential principles that enable civilization. But could they have been something more concrete? Data storage devices, instructional materials, technological artifacts? If the Anunnaki were actual advanced beings, how would ancient scribes, lacking the conceptual vocabulary for modern technology, describe things like computers, holographic displays, or genetic engineering equipment? This question cuts to the heart of the challenge in interpreting ancient texts. Even if they describe real advanced technology, we should expect those descriptions to be filtered through the conceptual frameworks available to the authors. A scribe who had never seen electronics would not describe circuits and transistors, but might describe magical inscriptions that glowed with inner light. Aircraft might be described as a chariot that flies, pulled by no visible beasts. Language itself limits what can be expressed. Before we had words for genetic, engineering, how would someone describe the deliberate manipulation of DNA? They might speak of mixing essences, of combining the clay of earth with the blood of gods, of creating new forms of life through divine knowledge and power, which is, intriguingly, exactly how the creation of humanity is described in the Anunnaki texts. The ziggurat temples themselves might have been more than mere religious structures. Some researchers have noted that their design, with conductive materials at different levels, could potentially function as primitive electrical generators or capacitors, particularly if topped with metal structures that could attract lightning. Was there a technological aspect to these buildings that has been lost? The use of gold, specifically, is interesting in the Anunnaki context. The texts say the Anunnaki came to Earth to mine gold, needed to save their planet's atmosphere. Why gold specifically? Gold is indeed useful for reflecting radiation, and is still used in space technology for this purpose. Gold is chemically inert, highly conductive, and doesn't corrode, properties that make it valuable for advanced technology. The ancient obsession with gold might have practical roots beyond mere aesthetic appreciation of a shiny metal. Ancient mining operations, as mentioned earlier, show evidence of being far older and more extensive than was once believed. The Ngwenya mine in Swaziland has been radiocarbon dated to at least 43,000 years ago, possibly older. Other African mines show evidence of very ancient operations. What were our distant ancestors mining, and why? If they were just hunter-gatherers, why invest enormous effort in extracting minerals from the earth? The standard explanation is that they were mining red ochre for ritual use and decorative purposes, but the scale of some operations seems disproportionate to that use. Could some of these ancient mines have been extracting gold or other metals for purposes we don't fully understand? Could there be a continuity between very ancient mining and the historical period that the Anunnaki texts describe? Let your thoughts drift through these mysteries without trying to solve them. The night is deep, and certainty is less important than the pleasant contemplation of possibilities. Whether advanced technology existed in the deep past, or whether ancient peoples achieved everything through natural means and remarkable ingenuity, they were impressive. They built civilizations, created art, developed philosophy, and left legacies that echo through millennia. Consider the Great Pyramid of Giza, built around 4,500 years ago. This structure remained the tallest human-made building in the world for over 300 years. Its construction required moving approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, some weighing 80 tons, with such precision that you cannot fit a knife blade between many of the stones. Its sides align almost perfectly with true north, south, east, and west. The ratio of its perimeter to height approximates 2p. Whether the Egyptians achieved this through conventional means, ramps, levers, abundant labour, and brilliant engineering, or whether they had help or knowledge from some external source, the accomplishment commands respect. The same is true for Stonehenge, for the megalithic temples of Malta, for the precision-cut stones of Cusco, for the vast temple complexes of Angkor Wat. Human beings, with determination, intelligence, and time, can accomplish remarkable things. We don't necessarily need to invoke outside help to explain these achievements, but the stories persist across cultures that there was outside help, that gods, or sky people, or ancestors from the stars taught humanity the arts of civilization. These stories might be entirely mythological, or they might preserve distorted memories of actual events. The Anunnaki narrative offers one framework for understanding these persistent traditions. It suggests a specific scenario. Extraterrestrial beings came to Earth for resources, created or uplifted humanity to serve as workers, gradually shared knowledge with humans and eventually withdrew, leaving humanity to develop independently but with a crucial head start. This narrative neatly explains several puzzling aspects of human history. The relatively sudden appearance of sophisticated civilizations, the similarities between geographically separate ancient cultures, the persistent myths of sky gods across different continents, the evidence of very ancient mining and megalithic construction, and the advanced astronomical and mathematical knowledge of ancient peoples. But it's not the only explanation. Convergent evolution of cultures facing similar challenges can explain many similarities. The human brain, developing similar cognitive capabilities across populations, would naturally develop similar solutions to common problems. The importance of tracking time for agriculture would lead any civilization to study the sky and develop calendars. The need for social organization would lead to hierarchies, laws, and religious systems that legitimate authority. Natural disasters, particularly catastrophic floods from post-Ice Age sea level rise or regional megafloods, could explain the widespread flood myths. The tendency of human memory to transform real historical figures into legendary ones could explain how ancient leaders became gods in later tradition, and humans are remarkably creative and intelligent. Perhaps we've consistently underestimated what our ancestors could achieve without outside help. Both explanations have merit, and perhaps the truth involves elements of both. Perhaps human civilization developed naturally, but with influence from encounters that we would now describe as extraterrestrial. Or perhaps the entire Anunnaki narrative is mythological, but within that mythology are encoded psychological and philosophical truths about human nature and our place in the cosmos. The question of whether we are alone in the universe remains open. Modern astronomy has revealed that planets are extremely common. Most stars have them. Many of these planets orbit in the habitable zones where liquid water could exist. The ingredients for life are widespread throughout the cosmos. The universe is billions of years old, giving plenty of time for life and intelligence to emerge in many locations. Yet we have found no definitive evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence. The SETI project has been listening for radio signals for decades without detecting anything clearly artificial from beyond Earth. No alien spacecraft have been unambiguously documented. No artifacts of undisputed extraterrestrial origin have been found. This absence is sometimes called the Fermi paradox. If intelligent life is common in the universe, why haven't we detected it? Where is everybody? Various solutions have been proposed. Maybe we're the first. Maybe intelligence is much rarer than we think. Maybe technological civilizations destroy themselves before expanding into space. Maybe interstellar travel is simply too difficult. Maybe they're out there, but deliberately avoiding contact with us. Or maybe they were here, long ago, and the Anunnaki story preserves a memory of that contact. Maybe they visited during humanity's formative period, made the changes described in the ancient texts, and then left, moving on to other stars and other worlds. Maybe they've been watching from a distance ever since, observing how their experiment unfolds. This is speculation, of course, but it's the kind of speculation that eases the mind towards sleep, drifting through cosmic possibilities without the burden of proof or certainty. Let your imagination play with these ideas like a child with toys, arranging them in different patterns, exploring different scenarios, not worrying about which is true. Imagine Nibiru, that distant world on its long elliptical orbit, swinging through the outer solar system in cold darkness for thousands of years before diving back toward the sun. Imagine the Anunnaki there, perhaps still looking back toward Earth occasionally, remembering their colony, wondering about the descendants of the species they created or uplifted. Do they watch us? Do they care? Will they return? Or imagine a different scenario. The Anunnaki never existed as described, but the myths about them reflect something else entirely. Perhaps they represent different aspects of human consciousness itself, the different drives and tendencies that shape our behaviour. Enki as the creative, compassionate part of ourselves that wants to learn and help others. Enlil as the part that values order, structure and discipline. Inanna as passion, desire and the will to power. In this interpretation, the conflicts between the Anunnaki are our internal conflicts writ large, projected onto cosmic figures to help us understand and navigate our own contradictions. The story of human creation becomes a metaphor for the development of consciousness itself. The flood represents the catastrophes we periodically face, both as civilizations and as individuals, that destroy old patterns and force us to rebuild. This psychological interpretation doesn't make the myths less valuable. Arguably, it makes them more relevant, as they then speak directly to our subjective experience rather than to historical events we cannot verify. Carl Jung explored such ideas in his work on archetypes and the collective unconscious, suggesting that certain narrative patterns and symbolic figures recur across cultures because they reflect universal aspects of human psychology. The gods of ancient Mesopotamia, by this reading, are not beings who once walked among us but are eternal aspects of the human experience, personified and projected outward to make them comprehensible. When we hear stories of Enki and Enlil debating humanity's fate, we're really exploring the eternal debate within ourselves between compassion and justice, between mercy and judgment, between the individual and the collective. Both interpretations can coexist in your drowsy mind. Maybe the Anunnaki were real alien visitors and also represent psychological archetypes. Maybe the myths are historically grounded and also psychologically profound. Layers of meaning need not exclude each other. A story can be true in multiple ways simultaneously. literal on one level and symbolic on another. As sleep draws ever nearer, the details matter less, and the overall sense of the narrative more. There is something comforting in these ancient stories, in knowing that humans have always wrestled with big questions, have always created elaborate narratives to explain themselves and their world. We are meaning-making creatures, unable to exist in a universe we perceive as random and purposeless. We create stories that give structure to experience, that connect us to something larger than our individual lives. The Anunnaki Chronicles serve this function beautifully. They provide a grand narrative that spans from before human existence through the creation of our species, to the development of civilization, to the eventual withdrawal of direct divine involvement, leaving humanity free to determine its own future. It's a coming-of-age story on a species level, moving from dependence on creator figures to autonomy and self-determination. Every culture has similar narratives in some form. The Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime stories tell of creation, and the teaching of human law and custom by ancestral beings. Native American traditions speak of sky people and culture heroes who brought essential knowledge. African and Pacific Islander cultures have their own accounts of origins and divine teachers. The universality of these themes suggests they address something fundamental about human experience and consciousness. Perhaps what all these stories are trying to convey is that we are not merely accidental, that our existence has meaning and purpose, that we are connected to forces greater than ourselves. Whether those forces are extraterrestrial visitors, gods in a traditional religious sense, the laws of nature, or the accumulated wisdom of our ancestors, the underlying message is similar. You matter. Your life has significance. You are part of something vast and important. This message is especially valuable in the quiet darkness of night, when existential questions sometimes press upon consciousness with uncomfortable insistence. The vast, indifferent universe revealed by modern science can feel cold and lonely. But the ancient stories remind us that humans have always felt small beneath the stars, have always wondered about their place in the cosmos, have always sought meaning, and have always managed to find it, create it, or receive it from somewhere beyond themselves. The Anunnaki, as characters in humanity's oldest written narratives, have accompanied countless minds through the night across thousands of years. Ancient Sumerian children probably heard these stories as they fell asleep. Babylonian teenagers might have pondered them while looking at the stars. Medieval scholars, reading the classical texts that preserved fragments of this knowledge, wondered about the mysterious pre-flood world. Modern readers, whether believers or skeptics, engage with the same narratives, asking the same questions. You are part of that long chain of wandering minds, connected backward to the first person who ever heard about Enki and Enlil, connected forward to people in the distant future who might still find these stories meaningful. Time collapses in such moments, and you touch something eternal, something that transcends your particular moment in history. Let that sense of connection carry you deeper into rest. You're not alone, not isolated, not meaningless. You exist within contexts, biological, evolutionary, historical, cultural, cosmic. The Anunnaki story, whatever its literal truth, affirms that our existence has context, has background, has meaning within a larger narrative. Sleep now comes more insistently, consciousness flickering like a candle in gentle wind. Thoughts become less coherent, more dreamlike. Images from the story blend with personal memories and imagination. Ancient ziggurats might mix with modern cities. The face of Enki might shift and change, becoming your own face, then a stranger's, then dissolving into abstract patterns. This is the liminal space between waking and sleeping, where boundaries dissolve and impossible things seem momentarily plausible. Here, you might almost believe you could speak with the Anunnaki if they exist somewhere in the cosmos. You might almost feel the presence of something vast and aware, something that knows you, something that has watched humanity since our beginning. Or you might simply feel the pleasant weight of drowsiness, pulling you down into darkness, into the temporary death that is sleep, from which you will be reborn in the morning. Either way, you are safe, you are at rest, you are exactly where you should be in this moment. The chronicles continue their own existence independent of whether any particular person is engaging with them. The clay tablets sit in museums, in university collections, in climate-controlled archives. Scholars continue to translate and debate them. New texts are occasionally discovered, adding details or raising new questions. The story evolves even as it remains rooted in its ancient sources. And here, in the darkness of this particular night, in this particular moment, they have served their ancient purpose once more, to carry a restless mind from the concerns of the present into contemplation of the deep past, to provide companionship through the lonely hours, to affirm that the questions we ask have been asked before and will be asked again, to remind us that we are part of something larger and longer lived than our individual existence. Sleep well, traveller through the night and through these ancient stories. May your rest be deep and your dreams be vivid but not troubling. May you wake refreshed, ready to face whatever challenges your particular moment in history presents. May you carry with you some small comfort from knowing that humans have always faced challenges, have always persevered, have always found meaning even in difficult circumstances. The Anunnaki watch over you now, whether as real extraterrestrial beings orbiting distant stars, as gods in their celestial realm, as psychological archetypes in your unconscious mind, or simply as characters in a very old and very persistent story that refuses to be forgotten despite the millennia that separate us from its origins. Rest now. Dream of ancient cities and cosmic visitors, of floods and survivals, of humanity's long journey from servitude to autonomy. Or dream of nothing at all, sinking into the peaceful void where consciousness temporarily ceases its constant activity. Either way, the night embraces you, as it has embraced every human who ever lived, as it embraced the ancient Sumerians who first told these stories, as it will embrace humans in the distant future who may finally know the full truth of our origins. Good night, seeker of ancient wisdom. Good night, modern person wrestling with timeless questions. Good night, conscious being in a possibly conscious universe. Good night, child of Earth, whether created by Anunnaki, evolved through natural selection, or brought into being by whatever other process the cosmos employs to produce awareness from matter. Good night, good night, good night. The chronicles are complete for now, sleep awaits, and in sleep perhaps you will travel to ancient Sumer, walk among gods and humans in that liminal age when the divine and mortal mixed freely. Or perhaps you will simply rest, and that rest itself will be enough, as it has always been enough, as it always will be enough. The story ends not with answers but with peace, not with certainty but with acceptance, not with grand revelations but with the simple gift of rest after a long day. Sleep now. Everything else can wait until morning. The mysteries will keep, the questions will remain, but for now, simply be at peace. The Anunnaki Chronicles fade into silence. The voice that has guided you through this journey grows quiet. Darkness and stillness surround you, and in that darkness and stillness, finally, blessedly, sleep arrives.